So today we're talking about mountains, and mountains are actually one of the most important symbols in the Bible. You're going to see it all over the place. So from the very beginning in Genesis until the very end in Revelation, they're everywhere. So you see, when you look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 10 through 14, let's go ahead and read that.
A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush, and the name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates.
All right, so you have those 4 rivers that flow out from Eden, and later on in different parts of the Bible will talk about how these rivers flow out of Eden and they water the 4 corners of the earth. So if that's the case, then obviously Eden had to be the highest point. So Eden was both a garden and a mountain. And that's actually incredibly important as we go through here. When we get to the book of Revelation and we see the New Jerusalem, it's basically a mountain. It has a mountain-like shape to it. And it's the New Zion, so it's also a mountain. So we start with mountains, we end with mountains, and then all through the Bible, almost every key point happens on a mountain. And there's a reason for that we want to understand. So let's look at Ezekiel chapter 28 and look at verse 13 through 15.
You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering: sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle. And crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you.
So that's actually, do you guys know what that's describing? It's describing Satan, right? So Satan was basically in this mountain setting on the mountain of God in Eden, and surrounded by these gems and gold and all that kind of stuff. So the question we want to ask ourselves is that why is it that we start with a mountain and end with a mountain? Why is it that the Ten Commandments are given from the Ten Commandments are given from a mountain? Why is it that the Sermon on the Mount happens on, why do we have the Transfiguration of Jesus happens on a mountain? The crucifixion happens on a mountain, right? Mount of Olives is where Jesus prayed. Why is it that we have so many mountain scenes in the Bible? What are your just preliminary ideas about why that would be the case?
God resides.
Okay, God resides on a mountain?
That's where God interacts with men.
Okay, so God interacts there?
The high points.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the Bible begins and ends with God, right?
Uh-huh.
So we talk about where He is.
Okay, so why is it that God is on a mountain? Why does God live on a mountain? So one of the interesting things is you go, have you guys ever seen the Everest, any of the documentaries about climbing Mount Everest? I have no desire. Like none of that looks interesting, appealing to me in any way. I just look at that and it looks like just, you see them trudging, like all this stuff is so cold and they're just trudging up this mountain. I don't know why that appeals to anybody. And then they have to take off like 3 months of work, and it costs like $50,000 if you're going to go with a reputable outfitter. And then, and then the other thing is, as you're climbing, there's over 100 bodies that are there, and because it's so cold all the time, they're basically frozen and preserved. And so you're camping next to bodies, you're hiking next to bodies, right? It's pretty nuts. And the question is, that seems like an odd place for God to reside.
I don't know if it's a modern thought or if it goes back to then, but I think of being higher is higher like the food chain. So
Yeah.
So you're looking up to someone, you're giving them respect.
Right.
Looking down, you're not.
Right. So there's an interesting thing that seems to be true of all human beings. And it doesn't matter really what culture you're in, because you can go to the Himalayas. That's a completely different culture of the people who live around there. You can go anywhere in the world, and the idea is always looking up. We associate that, there's a spiritual association with that pretty much everybody on the earth has. And one of the interesting things about that is, if you're running for president, do you want to be a tall person or a short person? You want to be a tall person, right? Almost all the presidents we've ever elected were tall guys. And Lincoln is a good example. I mean, he was very tall, and almost all the guys we elect are tall guys. So the interesting thing is, we associate that height with what? Why do we always elect tall people? Authority, yeah. Yeah, greater glory, greater wisdom, there's all these associations we have in our mind, and we always talk about heaven as if it's up, right? And it doesn't really make any sense, because what is the, when you go out into outer space, what does up mean exactly, right? But we always think of, from wherever we're at, heaven is up. So one of the things that we want to think about is that when we look at mountains, mountains are kind of a physical representation of a certain idea or certain spiritual reality that is translated almost throughout the world. And in fact, whenever you look at any kind of, it doesn't matter where you go in the world. You can go to Thailand, you can go to Cambodia, you can go down to Mexico, where the Aztecs, whenever people build temples, they always build mountains. That's what a temple is. It's a mountain. So, for instance, if you go down, I don't know if we talked about the movie Apocalypto, or is that what it's called, Apocalypto? Yeah. And it's set in like the Mayan or Aztec reign, and these guys are just going out into these different tribes and villages and capturing them and then bringing them up, and they climb all the steps up to the top of this basically fake mountain, which is what a temple is, and then they cut their heart out and then they toss them down the mountain, right? That's what they did. Now,
that's a bad day.
Yeah. And the thing is that it just was unending. In fact, apparently they think it started off as something that happened just occasionally, and then pretty soon it was just constant. It's a constant need to go out and conquer more people in order to take them up to the top of this mountain and cut them open and take their hearts out and throw them down. Just endless. So it doesn't matter what culture you go to, there are always mountains. And in fact, if you go to Greece, and where is it that you're going to go worship? Yeah, Mount Olympus, and you're going to, and you go, if you go to like the Temple of Zeus or whatever, you go up steps, and the roof is pointed like a mountain, right? And so this is universal, and it's really interesting that no matter what culture you go to, this is, it's hard to find different cultures than like the Aztecs and the ancient Greeks, or the Aztecs, or even modern people build temples, right? The Mormons are building temples all the time. So it's hard to imagine two different cultures, and yet it's the same. So there's qualities of mountains that make them perfect for this idea, or to be the manifestation of this idea. So Psalm chapter 46, we're going to look at quite a number of Psalms, because the Psalms go through this a lot. So you guys will be, if you turn in your Bibles if you want to, you don't have to, but if you do, you'll be in Psalms quite a bit, so you can stay there. Psalm 46.
Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling.
So it's saying that even if the mountains be moved, we won't fear. So what is it actually saying about mountains? Are they easy to move? No, they're very difficult to move. They're very solid. They stand there. They withstand time. They withstand attempts to move them. Those are important qualities of mountains for people's ideas of why they're important and why they're the meeting place of God. Psalm 104:32.
Who looks on the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke.
Okay, so mountains have a tendency to be volcanic in quite a lot of places in the world, and so that idea of fire on the mountain is important. When the Israelites were going through the wilderness and God is going to speak with them and he's going to give them a covenant. He's going to do that on Mount Sinai, right? That's a huge, like I said, every really major thing that happens in the Bible happens in or around a mountain. And so God is going to give them a covenant. He doesn't say, oh, well, just, park the Israelites anywhere and I'll meet with them there and we're going to give them the law. He says, no, you're going to go to this mountain. And then when they do go to the mountain, what's happened is the top of it is shrouded in smoke and flame. And that smoke and flame is actually an important aspect to this. One of the things that we'll see is like in Apocalypto, when you have the Aztecs, what do they do up on top of their mountain? Is they make sacrifices, right? So the idea of fire and sacrifice is going to be important with the idea of the mountain as well. So Psalm 83:14.
As fire consumes the forest, as the flame sets the mountains ablaze.
Okay, once again, we have mountains associated with fire. Psalm 18:7.
Then the earth reeled and rocked, the foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked because he was angry.
Let's go 144:5.
Bow your heavens, O Lord, and come down. Touch the mountains so that they smoke.
Okay, so once again, smoke is associated, but now we have something else, that is the mountaintop is closest to heaven. And this is actually an important thing to understand for the ancient world view. So in the ancient understanding of the world, there's basically three parts to the world. There's the heavens, then there's the land, and then there's the sea. Those are the three aspects of reality, basically. So when we talk about the ancients' worldview, we're not just talking about how they saw the physical world, we're also talking about how they saw the spiritual world. And in the ancient understanding, the world exists in three parts. And this is actually, if you've ever wondered why bad words are bad words, this is actually it. So I remember sitting I was waiting to get my tire changed at Discount Tire. And when you go to Discount Tire, you better wait or be prepared for a wait. So I was sitting there and I overheard a conversation. Some guy struck up a conversation with some woman, and I don't think she wanted to be part of the conversation, but he wanted her to be. And so, he just kind of rattled on. And one of the things he said, what about bad words? They're just made up words. That doesn't make any sense. Like, why are bad words bad words? And I didn't really want to be a part of the conversation, but I thought to myself, well, that's actually not true. The idea of bad words comes from the ancient understanding of the cosmos, of reality. And so in the ancient world, there's the heavens, and that's where the gods reside. That's where the spiritual world resides. That's where the non-physical things exist. You go up to the heavens and we still kind of have an idea of this, right? So when we imagine, like in cartoons, remember in cartoons when a character dies, what do? They go up and they're on a cloud and they're like strumming their harp or whatever, right? So we still have this kind of idea. So that's where the spiritual, once you're dead, that's where the spiritual world or the spiritual life exists, is in the heavens. And then you have the sea. And the sea is associated with chaos and disorder. And the heavens are actually associated with not only with spiritual things, but with order. Because order is itself a spiritual thing. And so the sea is very chaotic and disordered. You can't build anything with water, right? You can't shape water into a house or, it's just, and the storms, and you can't see underneath it. The Israelites kind of stayed away from, they weren't ocean people. They didn't like oceans. And that's the reason why. And in fact, the oceans are associated with the Gentiles. They're disordered people. And so in the Old Testament, all the heroes are shepherds because that has to do with land. And in the New Testament, all the heroes are fishermen because it has to do with bringing the Gentiles in. So the ancient worldview is you have these two extremes. You have the heavens and then you have the seas. And then you have the earth. And the earth is the middle between these two areas. And so you as a human being, your element is the earth. Because you're actually a go-between between the heavens and disorder. You're an in-between kind of thing. And so your realm is the earth. Now, the interesting thing about that is that you can, if you want to get close to the heavens, where are you going to go? You got to go up a mountain, right? That's how you do that. And so all the time, if you had a mountain, like monasteries are almost always built on mountains. If you have a mountain handy, that's generally where you're going to put your, where you're going to put your temple. You're going to put it on a mountain. Like where do the Jews worship now? They worship at the Temple Mount, right? The Wailing Wall at the Temple Mount, because it was built on a hill. Now, the interesting thing is that, so if you have a mountain handy, that's where you build your temple. If you don't, it doesn't matter, because your temple is a miniature, it's a fake mountain anyway. It's a symbolic mountain, because you're going to climb up to where God is. You're going to try to reach God. You're going to try to reach above earthly life, earthly existence. Now, what does that have to do with bad words? Well, bad words fall into one of two categories, right? So what are the two categories that bad words fall into? Yeah, profanity and vulgarity, right? So if you profane something, what are you doing? Yeah. So you're taking something high up. So we live in the earth, and what you're doing when you profane something is you're taking something from the heavens and you're lowering it down to earth, right? So the Bible talks about not profaning the name of God. And the idea behind that is you take something like God's name and you make it common. You drag it down into an area of life that it doesn't belong in. And life and being wise actually revolved around the understanding, the discernment of knowing which category things were in and keeping them in their proper categories. So you were a wise and discerning person if you knew which category to put things in your life into and you kept them there. So if you knew that things were holy and you kept them holy, you were a wise and discerning person. Now, so you don't want to profane things, but what's a vulgarity? A vulgarity is taking something that's below common everyday life and elevating it into common everyday life, right? So most of the terms that we think of as bad words are vulgarities. They're taking things that are vulgar and they're bringing it into everyday life, right? So you're sitting there talking and somebody goes, well, I don't give a blank what you want. This is what we're going to do, right? Does that seem like a vulgarity? Yes, right? Why? Well, imagine the guy just doing that act that he's speaking right there and right then, right? Would you do that? No. If you're in India, you would. Okay. So if you go to India, this is one of the crazy things. I don't know if any of you've ever been, but if you go there, and especially if you go into the rural parts, and since I was there quite a few years ago, I've heard that it's gotten a little bit better because the government's been doing this big push. But people
Go to San Francisco instead.
Right. Now you can go to any major city and see the same. Yes, and you can see the same thing. But I remember in India, I probably witnessed maybe, hundreds of people basically doing that very thing in my presence, right? They would just drop and do their business, and you're like, wow, I didn't need to see that, right? That's right, ever. And that's, so the thing is that when you speak those things, you're bringing things up from a realm they don't belong in, and you're bringing them into common everyday life. And those don't belong in common everyday life. They're too low for common everyday life. Now, they may be necessary in some instance. They may be, they may be something that has to be done, but you don't bring that into common everyday life. As an example, if you're in the military, so my sons were both in the Army, and there's a thing called Army talk, right? So one of the things that's really fun as a parent is you raise your kids and you tell them not to say bad words and all this kind of stuff, and then you send them to the Army, and the first thing that you hear when you're on the phone with them is all around them. You can hear over the phone every single person in every conversation is just profanities and vulgarities. Right. So why is that? You've heard of sailors do that. Why is it that that's where we find that kind of talk? Why do we find that in the military?
They're facing the dark place.
Yeah.
It's where the darkness happens more likely.
Yeah. So what are they being trained to do? They're Yeah.
Be in the dirt.
They're
Right in the dirt.
they're basically being trained to do something that is far below normal everyday life. And so you can take that on. And one of the things that's interesting is I was listening to, there's a guy named Jocko Willink who was a Navy SEAL, and he was a Navy SEAL commander, and he was talking about those kinds of words. And he was saying that, you know, he was a Navy SEAL, and in that you don't say to yourself or say to a guy under your command, good sir, if you don't mind and you have the time, would you mind going out and causing the deaths of some of these men? No, you say, you know,
Kill those bleeping-
right, yeah, that's what you do, right? Because you're engaging in that kind of world. But he talked about how he comes home and he doesn't want his kids in that world, right? You don't want your children to be a part of that world. And that gets to the idea that's an interesting one, because more and more of our culture rejects the idea that there's this realm of life that should be kept like these things should be kept separate. They talk about that not being real. But the question is, why would we want to separate life into these three categories? Why did the ancient people see it separated into these three categories, and why do we want to separate it into those three categories? Or why might we? Because maybe you don't, I don't know. Why do you want to have life separated into kind of the heavens, the earth, and the sea, as far as just understanding that some parts of life are too high to bring into to everyday life, and some parts are too low to bring into everyday life? Okay. What makes it the proper place? Why do we want to take effort to separate these things? You guys ever watch the show Monk? Yeah, it was a show about this detective that had all kinds of phobias and everything, and he had to keep everything separated, and obsessive compulsive disorder. Yeah, so he had to keep everything all separated, and it was exhausting for him. Like, it was completely. And some people will look at this idea as like almost something like that it's not necessary, and it's just exhausting part of life to separate all these things.
Well, I don't think you can have fruit with it. Order comes out of disorder, and I think the ultimate result or goal is for fruit to be made.
Right.
And so, I mean, like, if you're on not a garden, but like a huge garden,
Mm-hmm.
a farmer. So a farmer wants a field. he creates order out of chaos, but he's got to trudge through the dirt, and mud, and all that garbage before something good results from it.
Okay.
And that order has to come. So you don't want to eat out of the garden. Maybe you do.
Right.
That's not where you're going to fix your food.
Right.
That happens in the kitchen.
Okay.
Transitioning outward.
Yeah, so you can kind of use your house as an example of this. So in your house, you have like the front yard, and who gets to come into your front yard? Anybody, right? Bugs, snakes, salesmen, you know, people selling new windows to you, and, you know, solar panels, neighbors, right? Yeah, just anybody can come into that area. Now, your living room is a little bit different, right? You don't let just anybody come in there. And my son, they got this dog, and one of the first things that this dog did was proceeded to get out of the house and run down the street. And so my son is in his socks, Eric is in his socks, and he's running down the street. And they lived in kind of a bad neighborhood, and because that's what they could afford. And so he's running down the street in this bad neighborhood chasing his dog, and some guy is coming out of his house, and so the dog runs up to him on the porch, and Eric was worried about this guy kind of being afraid of the dog, but that wasn't the big problem. The dog decided to run into the house and is running around this guy's house and his living room and everything, and so Eric comes up to the door, and the guy's like, go ahead, go ahead and go after him. And so now he's in somebody's house that he doesn't know, and it feels very awkward and uncomfortable, and he's trying to chase down his dog. Right? You don't want Erics and dogs in your living room, right? You don't want that in your living room. If you don't want snakes, you don't want bugs, right? Especially, so what you do is you actually go around and you spray in your living room maybe for bugs, and you sweep it and you keep it clean. You don't sweep your front, gravel probably. You do all these things to maintain that boundary. And you do that because if certain things get into that boundary, they make your life very much worse than it was before those things came into that boundary, right? And it's very important to separate those things, because if you don't, your life is not what it should have been. It's not as good, it's not as pleasant, it's not as productive, it's not any of those things, right? It's the same thing from the standpoint of this idea of having this separation in just a spiritual sense in your life, that there are some things that maybe have to be done, but you don't want to start living there, right? If you're in the military and you maybe have to go out and you have to engage in destruction and death, does that mean you want to bring that home and start living there? No. In fact, that's one of the big problems that happens in the military, is some guys come home and they can't leave that behind. They can't, right? That follows them into their life. And if you can't make those separations, you end up bringing destruction into your life. It's basically like bringing a hornet's nest into your living room, or a bunch of vipers, right? A bunch of rattlesnakes. You bring them into your house, and what's going to happen is destruction. Well, there's certain spiritual things that you, on certain occasions, have to engage in, but you bring those into your home at your peril. You bring those into your life at your peril, right? And it's actually not as obvious as you think it is what things need to be left out, because people all the time bring things into their living room, so to speak. They bring things into their life that cause destruction without realizing that they do. Like, what are some of the things that you bring into your life that cause destruction? Yappy little dogs, right? So yappy little dog is a picture of something that isn't obviously something that needs to be excluded from your life.
It's so cute.
Right, but when you get it home, it's not.
This is a purely theoretical example.
Right.
I'm just
Along with the cat that
hypothetical.
throws up on everything.
Yeah.
The thing you're talking about with bringing it home, where we see that, I think, all the time in our culture, and you're probably aware of it, the marriage family situation for police is horrible
Yes.
compared to everybody else.
Right. Yeah, 75% divorce
What
rate.
you do if you're a cop, you spend your entire day making people do what they don't want to do.
Mhm.
I mean, if you kind of boil it down, that's what a police officer does. He makes people do what they don't want to do.
Right.
Then you go home. And they don't do well,
Right.
statistically.
They start treating the family like they do.
Sure. Right. Yeah. So here's the thing that's interesting, is we can recognize that, and police do have like a 75% divorce rate. It might even be higher than that now, but that's the last statistic. I don't know what my problem is with words today. The last statistic that I saw. But the interesting thing is that you don't have to go to as an extreme of an example as that. So here's the thing. Let's say you work in a business where you're constantly dealing with one customer after another. Okay, you're not dealing with criminals. You're not having to arrest people. You're not having to command people to do stuff. But you're just dealing with one endless stream of persons after another. How do you cope with that job?
You don't see them as people.
Right, you don't see them as people anymore, right? They're just a thing. Is it possible to start treating people in your family or your friends or other people in your life like that? Here's the thing, is it's possible for things to bleed in, and it might be necessary for you to do it. As a doctor or maybe a nurse, you might have to develop an ability to see a person as a patient and not as a person. And it's also possible that you come home and you start dealing with people in your life like that as well. You do that, and you'll see how quickly your life can fall apart. And it's not always obvious, right? And in fact, even just looking, maybe in the business, you have to, this happens all the time. I was watching a video of a woman who was a former police officer, And she ended up quitting that and getting out of it. And it wasn't the fact that she was just being violent or anything like that. She just said it just made her look at objectives, and it made her look like, okay, what am I trying to accomplish here? And so all of her interactions with people were starting to become very, what do you call that? It was just about what needs to be done. They weren't seen as human beings anymore. Just problems. Everybody became a problem to be solved. And she realized what it was doing to her. It was very efficient. It was a very good way of getting through the workday, but it was a terrible way. You can be a CEO, right? And you can start seeing people as a means to an end of accomplishing something, and then you come home and you start treating people like that, and you'll see that it doesn't work very well. There are so many things that are like that in the world. And you have to be able to separate those things. That's what discernment and wisdom is the ability to understand what stuff is too low, what stuff is too high, and what stuff where life is. Now, the thing is with stuff that's too high, like what is that? We could think to ourselves, well, how can you bring things that are too high into the real world? Like what's a good example of not of vulgarity, but of profanity? How can you profane your life?
You think of yourself as not fully human?
Okay.
Drugs, you don't value your life. Is that what you mean?
No, it's taking something too high and bringing it down into the world. Have you?
You're talking about like misusing God's name?
Well, so misusing God's name is one aspect of it, but there's other aspects. So if the heavens are the place of order, have you ever met anybody whose standards are so absolutely impossible that you can't bear to be around them?
Yeah, my wife's married.
He
I say
recognizes that.
it before she.
Right. Now, have you ever met somebody that everything just has to be perfect? Everything has to be so well ordered that it's not functional anymore. You can't perfection. So one of the things that's interesting is in the Old Testament you have all of these different laws about mixtures and about going too far. As an example, let's say that Ken has a field and Ken plants his field. Ken's not allowed to glean to the edges of his field. He has to leave the corners of his field ungleaned, and he can't glean he can't go through it twice either. He can only go through it once. Those were laws. Those were Old Testament laws, and people look at those laws and think, wow, the Old Testament's so dumb. Like, why do they have these stupid laws? There's actually a principle behind that. And the principle is, don't try to bring perfect order into your world. That's something that belongs in the spiritual realm, but it doesn't belong in the physical realm. Like, you can bring order, but it takes wisdom and discernment to know how much order is actually beneficial and useful, and how much order starts to become destructive, because that's a heavenly thing and you're dealing with the earth. Okay, so here's one of the ways that I see this unfold all of the time. In fact, we're seeing this. I was just reading an article that the marriage rate dropped in 2018. This is before pandemic and all that. Marriage rate dropped to 6.5 per 1,000, which is the lowest that it's been in over 120 years. And one of the things that's happening is that women and men are when you talk to them about why they're not getting together, both of them have expectations on the other one that are so high that it's just not, it's almost never going to happen. So you'll have people who, let's say a woman is just an average woman, but she wants a man that makes $350,000 a year. Otherwise, and she says, I'm not going to settle. That's one of the big things that you hear now. I'm not going to settle because this is my standard. This is what I think I deserve, and I'm not going to settle. If you can't do this, then I'm not. And when asked about, well, you consider yourself an average woman, what about an average man who makes an average amount? No, I could never do that. I could never do that, right? So you have these are great, like ideals, but they don't necessarily translate very well when you bring them into your life. Now, the thing is that a lot of our life is like that, right? I've heard a lot of people who talk about, well, I don't, one of the things that's happened with Nicole is as she's doing online dating, she'll ask guys about their church, and it's amazing how many times you hear, well, I used to go to church, but I haven't found one. I'm looking. Currently looking for a church. How long have you been looking? Oh, it's been like 4 or 5 years, right? And you're like, wow, that's kind of a long time. Now, it's one thing if you're just really not really looking. But some people do. They're actually searching. But what happens is we got a list. We had, how many pages was that email? It was like 3.5 pages of the, can you attest that your church is this? It was like a 3.5 page list of things that before this person would come visit our church, we had to attest, we had to vow, we had to promise that our church met these criteria. 3.5 pages of criteria, and the thing is that heaven itself would have a hard time with this, and so I was like, I can't attest to that. But the interesting thing, though, is when you read the New Testament, the letters that Paul writes, are any of those churches perfect? No, if you look at the New Testament letters, like every one of those churches had like serious problems.
Well, that's why he wrote them.
Right. And the thing is that all those churches are really, there wasn't like some great church. And one of the things that I've seen is that sometimes people can get to the point where there's no marriage that's good enough for them, there's no company that's good enough for them, there's no church that's good enough for them. They look around at their life and they won't involve themselves in anything because it doesn't meet their standards. And the reality of the situation is that this is what this idea speaks to, that there's the heavenlies that are perfect, and then there's complete and utter chaos. And you have to really be careful about either one of these too much coming into your life. Now you say, well, how could you have too much perfection? Well,
the heavens being perfect, if you look back at the problems like Galileo,
mm-hmm.
what was the big deal? Well, one of them was, what's the center of the world?
Right.
But the other one was when they realized that the orbits were ellipses.
Yeah.
And ellipses aren't perfect circles.
Right. Yeah.
So Ptolemy's model was circles.
Yeah.
And I mean, they were killing people.
Yeah, one of the things I was reading about is how many times the elegant solution has meant that scientists get it wrong because they're looking for that perfect, like theoretical. But the perfect exists in theory, but once you apply it to actual real world conditions, it's not anymore. It's not going to happen. And so, life is messy. So if you have kids and you want your kids to be perfect, we were watching this morning actually this woman who was in the North Korean army and she defected. She was in the North Korean army for 8 years and she defected, and she lives in South Korea now and has a YouTube channel where she tries to tell people about what North Korea is really like. And she was watching videos of American fathers with their kids, and she was completely blown away. And in fact, at one point she was moved to tears by the fact that these American fathers, she said, well, they look big and tough, so I thought that they might be tough. But they were playing with their kids, and they were like, one dad was wearing a costume, and she's like, no, a North Korean dad would never do that, never. And she started talking about just how they were, they didn't see their job as doing that. They laid down the law, they had their expectations. That's what dad's role was. But one of the things that she recalled is when she was a kid, they had to go around and play their instruments for the different companies that their school class, if you had a father that worked at a company, the whole class would come and perform at that company. And so they went to one company after another, and soon they got to her dad's company, and her dad was an engineer. He was high up. He was the highest up in whatever group came out to see them. And so when she got there, she was so nervous that she made a few mistakes, and at the end, she said everybody clapped, and she saw that her dad was just sitting there looking very, very unhappy. And so she dreaded the whole time going home. And when she got home, she said that her dad, the first thing out of his mouth was that the best you could do? You embarrassed me in front of all my employees. And then he beat her because she made mistakes, right? Because why? She's not good enough. She's not perfect. And so you have, that's the idea of mountain. So a mountain is where the perfection actually touches the earth, right? So this is a really important idea for us in understanding temples and sacrifices and all this kind of stuff, because we're going to get into that later, is that the heavenlies are basically unattainable perfection, and you don't flippantly walk into the heavenlies, because you don't have the power to make that happen. In fact, sometimes as you strive for perfection, you actually end up messing things up. You don't belong in the heavenlies, but the point at which the earth touches the heavens, that's the place where you want to be. The place where you're at the highest you can possibly be. Because you're still dirt, right? You're still part of this earth. But there's a place at which you can go where you're the highest you can possibly be, where you're connecting to the heavens just as much as you possibly can. That's where you want to be, right? And it takes wisdom and discernment, like a whole lot of wisdom and discernment to do that, right? When you see somebody who's really doing something well and not overdoing it, that looks easy. But you know, right, that it's actually so much more difficult to do that than you think it is, right? You see somebody who's running a company really well, and you say, oh, wow, they make it look easy. Man, that is anything but easy. You see somebody who's running their family really well. That is anything but easy. Because you have to have that balance of being able to pull them as much as they can be pulled up, but not push so hard that things start collapsing, right? So we want to understand that as we get into this, because mountains, one of the things we'll see is that mountains are sacred sites. And so that's the next thing that we want to look at. So Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 14.
After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together.
Okay, that's good. We'll stop there just because we don't want to read. We're running out of time here. But the point here is that Abraham is basically being called to go offer his son. And so what he's going to do is he's going to take him up the mountain. And so the question is, what do you find when you get up the mountain? Like when you're at the highest place you can be, still being what you are, still being a human being, when you're at the highest place you can be and you can't get any higher, what do you find there? And what basically all of the religions say is what you find there is sacrifice. What you find there is sacrifice. So if you were an Aztec, the reason that you built, I mean, think about how they didn't have power equipment and excavators and those kinds of things, and yet they built this giant big mountain. So what? So that they can climb up to the top of it and cut somebody's heart out. I mean, you couldn't do that on the ground? No. We need to build this. Think about how mad that is. Like you know what we need to do? We need to spend the next few years and get all the extra hands we can to build this giant mountain. Okay, well, what are we going to do when we get there? We're going to cut people's hearts out at the top of it. Okay, well, that makes sense. Yeah, let's do that. And you get the whole society behind that, and that's what they do, is they build this giant mountain, spend all this time, energy, money, all that kind of stuff, and then what do? They cut people's hearts out on the top of it. That's so mad to think about, and yet that's at the heart of basically every religion, is there's a sacrifice there. Now, what's the difference here? The difference here is that it's actually not you who's doing the sacrificing, and it's not you who kind of is the sacrifice. Now, there's a sense in which it is you, and there's a sense in which it's not. So what happens is, remember that Abraham goes up there and he's going to sacrifice his son. Now, here's the thing. Every other religion's about sacrificing something else. And that's kind of the highest thing. So if you're an Aztec, you're going to go conquer somebody else and you're going to sacrifice them. And that's the highest thing, is when you sacrifice somebody else. In most cultures, that's what they're built on. They're built on, you find somebody and you sacrifice them, and that's how you restore order. That's how you get as close as you possibly can to perfection. So think about a baseball team. Let's say you have a baseball team. You're the manager of a baseball team, and you're failing. Your team's no good. It's just doing so bad.
Well, that's easy to imagine.
Right. Okay. So what do you do as the manager? What do? You just say, "Hey, we'll try harder next year." What do?
Get rid of the deadwood.
You get rid of the deadwood, right? That's the key. You're going to sacrifice the things that aren't close to heaven in order to get closer to heaven. You're going to sacrifice those things. And obviously those things aren't going to be you, because then you can't get any higher, right? So you're going to sacrifice the deadwood. You're going to sacrifice the things and that's actually the way that you get close. So if you have a company and your company is not doing very well, you look at, okay, what part of my company? Is it sales? Is it service? Is it, what part of my company is doing poorly? And then you drill down, okay, well, what part of that part isn't doing well? And you come up with the names Bill, Fred, and Tom, and you say, those guys need to be gone by Friday afternoon, right? It's always Friday afternoon. And then they're gone, and now your company's going to be doing better, right? That's the way.
Not if you're the Diamondbacks.
Right.
Do it the other way.
Right. Yeah. They say who's doing really good. Let's get rid of them.
Yeah, that's about right.
So that's an example of that's how you don't climb the mountain, right? That's how you right, exactly. So this was the kind of the early ancient wisdom, is you get rid of those things that are keeping you from getting closer to God. You get rid of those things. Now, the interesting thing is that the New Testament is going to change this up a lot. And it's going to be, the highest thing is when Jesus gives up his life. And so what you'll see as we kind of finish this mountain thing up next week and we go into altars, is that the way that you get your life as close to heaven as it can be is not the way that the ancient world thought it was. That's a way, that is a way of making things better, but it actually doesn't get you where you think you want to go. It actually doesn't get you there. And so the New Testament is actually going to change this around. We're still going to have a mountain, but what we're going to see is what's sacrificed on the top of it is something completely different. Okay, so let's end there, and then hopefully that wasn't too esoteric because we didn't get a chance to finish it up. But next week I think it'll start making more sense, and you can probably find ways to really apply that. So let's pray. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for the blessings that you've given us. We ask, Father, that you'd help us to see the glory of your word. Help us to understand, Father, in our life how we might pursue you and glorify you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.